World Cup match. Okay. I was just going to say, I don't know whether the World Cup match between Iran and England has been played yet. I don't want to get into that because I want to watch it later. My timings are a little upside down. But anyway, the Marx Memorial Library, by far my favorite institution in what it was formerly known as the United Kingdom. Anyway, I hope you can hear me okay. I want to make a few comments about the question of decolonization, decolonial thought, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and so on. If you're interested, I would like to recommend that you go to the website of the Tricontinental, which is thetricontinental.org, and download our dossier, which we did with the Casa de las Americas in Havana, Cuba. This is called 10 Theses on Marxism and Decolonization. Now, I'm not actually going to talk directly about this text or from this text, but I highly recommend the text at any rate. I think it might be useful for people to read and study. It's a very slim text, like all our monthly dossiers, but this one in particular, I highly recommend. So please go and have a look at it. Now, you know, we are in a very tough place right now. Obviously, you know, Europe is definitely convulsed by the conflict in Ukraine. That's what the focus is on. The knock-on effects of that conflict are going to impact people with the cost of living in places, you know, that run from Germany, which is already experiencing quite high inflation, high energy prices as a consequence of the cutoff, you know, largely the slowing down of Russian natural gas. Certainly the destruction of Nord Stream 2 is going to have long-term impact for cost of living in Germany, but also in the rest of the continent and in England and Scotland, Wales, and so on. Okay, so we know that that's where the focus is on largely, you know, get rid of the war in Ukraine. It's interesting, of course, that so little focus is on other wars that are ongoing on the planet, including, I just reported the conflict from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where in the eastern flank of that country, once more, we are waiting for an invasion, in fact, an expeditionary type force coming in from Uganda, from Kenya, other countries. That country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, over the last 30 years, has seen a death toll in the millions, perhaps up to 8 million people dead, and almost zero international interest in that conflict. That's one of the reasons why even the government of South Africa under Cyril Ramaphosa, even that government, which is not a government of the left, even that government came out in public and said, look, the war in Ukraine is not our war, it's your war, it's a European war. We are not really going to touch that. Indian government, a government of the right, has said, look, we are not prepared to condemn anybody for this because it's your war. We have our own conflicts. India has a conflict about the border with China. That's, you know, their conflict, India's conflict. Why does India need to comment on the war in Ukraine? Right now, the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, is in Moscow. Similar noises from Latin America. This is a European war. This is not the world's war. I'm starting here because it's an interesting phenomena. This idea that, you know, people in places all around the world must have an opinion on something that is directly to do with Europe. In other words, Europe's history, again, makes a claim to being universal history, whereas the history of, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Congolese people, have no claim to universal history. Why isn't Europe convulsed by those events in the DRC? The Cubans might turn around and say, look, every year at the United Nations, 183, 185 countries vote to end the US unilateral blockade of Cuba, an act of war since 1960, a war that the United States has prosecuted all these decades. they might turn around and say, we belong in universal history. Why is it that we have to now comment on Europe's history, but Europe is uninterested in us? We are not, our human rights are not there to be defended and so on. This is the prevailing new wave, prevailing mood now, wave of this mood, wave saying that, you know what, we are not interested in actually accepting that your history is universal history. I would like to underline this. It's very interesting that you see this, from the left, that is to say the government in Cuba, all the way to the right, the government in India, across the global south, in other words, formerly colonized parts of the world. Countries are just saying, to quote from Black Panther #1, not today, colonizer, not today. Actually, the most striking expression of this comes from the Indian foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, who said very clearly, when asked, when challenged, when told actually by a reporter, why doesn't India stop buying oil from Russia, was actually scolded by the Western reporter. He was quite calm in the way he is, and he replied by saying, I've been looking into this, he said, and the oil that India buys in a month, Europe buys in an afternoon from Russia. He said, think about it. And I thought that kind of measured attitude is essentially a paraphrase of that emblematic expression, not today, colonizer, not interested in being bullied by you, by being told by you what I should do. One saw this at the G20 in Bali, Indonesia, an attitude from heads of states not to kowtow to Joe Biden or to Justin Trudeau. The scolding that Justin Trudeau received from Xi Jinping, which was widely circulated across the South, and I dare say across sections of the North as well, where Xi Jinping basically told him, you behave like a schoolboy when it comes to diplomacy, and Justin Trudeau had to skulk off after making those comments. This is a new mood. What is this mood? Can we characterize it as a mood of a residue of anti-colonialism, perhaps? Some kind of residue? Not to say that these governments are necessarily governments of the people or governments of the left or anything. As I said, Mr. Modi's government in India, a neo-fascist government. Nonetheless, this is the prevailing mood. It has to be mentioned. Add to this the fact that the French have been booted out of Mali, out of Guinea. When Emmanuel Macron went to Oran in Algeria, he was jeered, he was booed. People said, get out of here, France. Macron had to jump into his car and make a quick escape. A new attitude. In fact, now the European countries, including the United Kingdom, are trying to regroup in West Africa and the Sahel region. You might want to know that one of your high officials has gone to Accra, Ghana, to basically lay out an agenda with the Accra Initiative, which is supposed to substitute for the various other plans and plots that the Europeans have had for that Sahel region of Africa and West Africa. Your Minister of State for Defense, James Heapy, is there in Accra trying to push the Accra Initiative as a substitute. In other words, not today, colonizer is the vibe from the street, but this doesn't stop the old colonial past from constantly trying to reinstate their authority. Now, of course, banding about terms such as human rights and, that other people are imperialists, the Russians, the Chinese, and so on. Let's forget about the imperialism of Europe or of the United States. Let's ensure that for whether propaganda purposes or purposes of their own clarity, they would like the world to believe that the only imperialists on the planet today are in Beijing or in Moscow. The old imperialism, which morphed into neocolonialism, that should be forgotten. That's the prevailing mood. Well, let's now come back to the question of theory a little bit. You see, until about the 1980s, around the time of the great debt crisis that racked the third world, bankrupted several countries, including Mexico. 1982 went into a serious debt situation from which it has barely recovered, if you're honest about it. During the time of the debt crisis, as the Soviet Union was weakening, as we began to see an attack being launched by the Western warrior states against countries, in Central America, the coup in Burkina Faso against Thomas Sankara in 1987, and so on, right through the 1980s, in the Western academic centers, ideas of anti-imperialism began to lose focus. In fact, it began to be a term, imperialism, that evoked a lot of eye rolling, as if it was an anachronistic term. We began to hear new words, in other words, as substitution, talking about globalization, the flatness of the world, that in the World Trade Organization set up in 1994, all countries will have a kind of equivalence, that the term imperialism, the concept imperialism, the structure of imperialism, it's not something to bother oneself with. There was a sustained attack at Marxism in this period, led, I'm afraid, by a publisher in London, that is to say, New Left Books, now Verso Books, which published a book by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe in 1985 called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, which I think mischievously utilized the work of Antonio Gramsci to make an attack at Marxism, to in fact champion something they called post-Marxism, post-structuralism, post-Marxism, post-colonialism. This becomes the flavor of the academic literature coming out of Western countries from the 1980s. Scholars of the left, many of them either went into retreat, producing empirical work of one kind or the other, but didn't want to frontally challenge these schools of thought. Particularly after the Soviet Union, there was a great weakness in our ability to fight back against this denigration of Marxism in the name of post-Marxism. My great comrade who died last year, Ejaz Ahmed, who died this year, earlier this year, Ejaz Ahmed used to say that all this talk of post-Marxism is actually pre-Marxist, that Laclau and Mouffe, in fact, returned to the texts before Marxism, a kind of idealism. When they talk about agency and the subject and so on, they have basically walked away from the structuring impact of political economy and returned to a pre-Marxist time. They have in fact not gone beyond Marxism, but gone back to a time before Marxism. It's an interesting observation, and I'd like to just leave that there. Okay, so what to do with the fact that there's rising inequalities between North and South, between the fact that poverty rates increased in many parts of the world, despite the fact that industrial plants were exported from the center of the world economy, Europe and North America, to other parts of the world. Now, one has to understand that the industrialization that was part of the agenda of the anti-colonial movement in an earlier period was not industrialization piecemeal. It was industrialization whole hog, so that you could produce national economies, regional economies. You could improve and diversify economies out of a kind of one crop colonial economy. That was the agenda from an earlier period when they said we must have import substitution, industrialization. It wasn't just to have a factory in the country. It was actually to change the balance of forces in the world economy, in the structured world economy, structured by imperialism. But now, in this era of globalization, as you saw factories be disarticulated, you didn't get a whole car company moving from Germany to India. What you got is a tire factory or a transmission belt factory, or you got somebody making spark plugs. The disarticulation of production was what got globalized. Globalization effectively wasn't that industry spread around the world. It's that these disarticulated forms of manufacturing spread around the world. So all of this happened at a time when Marxism was extremely weak and in a way had been put into the back seat. And you got from the camp of Marxism, the old Marxists produced a work such as Antonio Negri's book Empire, which argued that there was no real center to this empire. It was a rhizome in the way of the Felix Deleuze and Guattari's work on rhizomes and so on. That this was a kind of postmodern economy. It was not an economy with a center and so on. Forget the fact that the city of London or that Wall Street or that the Finanzplatz in Frankfurt continue to structure a great number of parts of the global supply chain. Forget the fact that the new international property rules set in place in the World Trade Organization allowed firms such as Apple to basically not produce anything. Apple doesn't make any computers or anything. Those are made in disarticulated factories by Foxconn and other companies, and Apple merely makes money on rent. It basically makes money on its patent. This was extraordinarily a period of some confusion for people. Even David Harvey writing, I think, quite pointedly saying that, well, the evidence for imperialism is not there because foreign direct investment has increased in the South and you have industrialization in the South. But that was just looking at one indicator, foreign direct investment flows, or the growth of industrialization, of manufacturing capacity. Wasn't looking at the structure of the world system as a totality and trying to understand how these countries, even India, despite the major advances made by sections of the population, continued to be structured into a position of subordination. This was all not seen very clearly. And in the middle of this, the energy that would have perhaps gone towards trying to analyze the new kind of colonial tentacles and so on, that energy was dissipated. And it became, in a sense, like much of what post-structuralist thought had done, it became kind of culturalist. In other words, looking for the cultural subordination of people by others. What multiculturalism had done inside the metropolitan countries to take out, in a way, the questions of race as a structuring principle in the economy, the structure of racism, rather than look at that, look at attitudes and behaviors and so on. That if you could have seminars for people and they stop behaving like a racist, well, that's enough. Train the police to sensitize themselves to Black youth, and then they'll stop shooting Black youth. Not allowing us to think about the fact that the shooting of Black youth in London, for instance, isn't about attitude and behavior alone, but those attitudes and behavior are structured into the political economy. And that has to be understood in a deep way, in the same way as multiculturalism basically took the guts out of an anti-colonial, anti-racist critique. In the same way, at the global level, you had the arrival of post-colonial thought and also decoloniality. In other words, let's look at power, let's look at culture, but let's not look at the political economy that structures everyday life and behavior and reproduces the colonial mentality. That has to be off the table. So we entered into this kind of academic morass where Marxism, in a sense, was not permitted to enter. Giant sign at the door of the academy. Marxism cannot come in unless it wants to slink in through a little mouse hole and just stay there as a cottage industry in a campus where there's one nutcase Marxist professor allowed per university, just in order to say that we allow diverse views. But Marxism actually must remain there inside that little mouse hole and can't have the confidence to launch an attack at the mainstream thinking. Radicalism then appears as multiculturalism or as decoloniality, as decolonial thought and so on. But God forbid you ask questions about the mining of coltan in the Congo. God forbid you ask questions about copper mining in Zambia, transfer payments, the theft of the wealth of the people, that 60% of the children who live above the seam of copper in the copper belt region of Zambia can't read. Those questions can't be on the table. Eyes will roll. Eyes will roll, if not heads. Eyes will roll in the seminar room, and the heads may roll if that mouse-like Marxist academic tries to get out of their little lane and challenge people in particular, your contract may not be renewed. That was the state of affairs until recently, and in fact, even now. And therefore, what I'm trying to suggest in these brief remarks is there's a disconnect. The contradictions of actual human processes has produced a situation where you get from Cuba to India, country governed by the left, socialist experiment in Cuba, to a neo-fascist government. You got a new mood of anti-colonialism. But of course, intellectual thought, particularly in the Western warrior states, just doesn't know how to tackle this, how to understand this. Eyes are rolling again. And then, of course, heads may roll. You can get canceled on Twitter and so on if you don't toe the party line. Party line being, it's okay to talk about attitudes and behavior. Can't talk about structured wholes, the structured political economy, which has immense effects in social and cultural life and so on. Now, let me just make 3 quick points, and I'm looking forward to hearing Mary on this, but 3 quick points. The retrieval of Marxism into this domain, the retrieval of our tradition is very important. That's the first thing. We have to go back. We have to read the national liberation Marxists of an earlier period. Go back and read, Kwame Nkrumah's terrific book from 1965, Neocolonialism. You see, it's one thing people are reading Walter Rodney now, and I'm happy for that because Rodney is a key figure in this. But before Rodney was Nkrumah. Nkrumah theorized the emergence of neocolonialism in his 1965 book. We have to go back and read Ho Chi Minh. We have to read EMS Namboodiripad. We have to read Fidel Castro, seriously engage with Castro's thinking on some of these issues. I think that's the first thing, is that we've got to go back and create a new tradition. Our Marxism is not a Marxism which is Marxology, going back constantly to get quotations from Marx. We have to also look at how Marxism had life breathed into it by Lenin, by the great Marxists in the colonized world. As I said, all the way from Jose Carlos Mariátegui in the Andes to Ho Chi Minh, to Tan Malacca and others. We have to go and recover this tradition. That's one of the tasks of our institute, Tricontinental. We are very keen on the recovery of this tradition as much as possible. Secondly, we have to insist that the actual history of colonialism be taught in schools. In Britain, for instance, there's a refusal to teach even the history of Jallianwala Bagh, the great massacre in 1919. Where's the apology for that? The Jallianwala Bagh campaign that was led by the Indian Workers Association, such a key campaign. Every British person who is sensitive should be part of this campaign to demand that young children learn about the actual history of British imperialism. Can't sanitize Churchill. If you don't face up to the past, you'll repeat it constantly. You'll repeat it constantly. And the fact that the Tory government, from whether it's Boris Johnson, good God, that guy, all the way out to now Rishi Sunak, the fact that Sunak can give a speech recently where he said that Britain has always fought for freedom. I mean, for God's sake, Britain only understood freedom because we all fought against British imperialism. Britain doesn't understand freedom. If it understood freedom, it would have had a different history. For God's sake, let's be honest. And to have Rishi Sunak say that just yesterday is a sign that history is not being taught in the way it must be taught. So that's the next thing. First, recover our tradition. Second, we should fight to have the actual history of imperialism taught. I'm very glad Tariq Ali wrote that book on Churchill, and I hope that everybody has read it. It's written in the classic Tariq Ali style, is casual and biting, and Churchill deserves it. That's the biographer of Churchill you need. Not some Tory MP who writes a 3-volume book on Churchill on the side, actually written by some interns and so on. We don't need that. We need an actual story about Churchill. Third, the structure of imperialism today. I mean, when are we going to come to terms with the fact that imperialism reproduces itself constantly? The city of London is a criminal venture. It's a mafia place where mining companies, Canadian mining companies, domicile themselves. In Britain, you right now have a debate about non-dom status in paying taxes. The non-doms are not paying tax. I mean, come on, for God's sake, the whole city of London is a non-dom place of transnational corporations. And you're talking about non-dom like you're being so high and mighty, but not allowing into that debate the fact that the city of London is a non-dom location. Bring the city of London into international law. Don't allow secret corporations to incorporate there and basically transfer profits out of places where they're extracting minerals without paying the high royalties that they should be paying. It's very interesting that Indonesia recently put on the table to create a nickel cartel, asking Canada to join. I don't think Canada is going to join, doesn't have the stomach for it. But it's interesting that we're back to cartelization of raw materials, and let's see where that goes. So the third issue is, let's talk again about structure. Let's talk about how the global economy is actually structured. How, for instance, it's not Chinese companies that are out there, alone exploiting African workers and so on. What about the Canadian companies? 60% of the world's mining companies are Canadian. No light is shone on them. Just because Justin Trudeau is some sort of dauphin, child prime minister, doesn't mean that the country of Canada should get a free pass. Canada led, by the way, the attempt to overthrow the government of Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, because the Canadian government was under pressure by Barrick Gold to conduct that coup in 2002. Also, Canada's role in Haiti, unremarked, but should be. The role of the United States in Haiti in recent years, horrendous. The structure needs to be looked at honestly and clearly. And by the way, most of the things we do at Tricontinental on the structure, we get the evidence directly from World Bank, IMF, and UN reports. You don't need to even go further than the mainstream. The material is there. It's just that the epistemology used to look at that material is actually quite, in my opinion, childish. It's idealistic, perhaps. Okay, fourth and last, mentality. It's interesting. There is a kind of battle of ideas, what the phrase Fidel used in the early 2000s and late 90s, around what or how we understand the world, mentality, the colonial mentality, this idea that you can lecture countries around the world about how and what they should be doing. Very interesting. Just because Rishi Sunak is of South Asian origin doesn't make him anything other than a prime minister of the British ruling class. If he's a prime minister of the British ruling class, the fact of his origin is hardly going to change the way people in India see another British prime minister scolding them. That colonial mentality that allows countries in the Western warrior states, governments in the Western warrior states to go out there telling other people what to do, that has to be also put on the table, and it has to be exposed for what it is. Look at it like this. At COP26 in Glasgow, Western warrior states were chiding India, China, other countries for using coal. Now, because they are refusing to allow the war in Ukraine to come to a close, they are talking about opening coal-fired power plants in Germany, maybe even in the UK. Well, too bad. Thatcher destroyed much of that possibility. I don't know, maybe you'll open up your minds again. But just a year ago, Western warrior states, high and mighty, stop using coal. A year later, let's use coal. This is the colonial mentality. What's okay for the Western warrior states is not permitted for the formerly colonized world. That attitude has to be exposed for what it is. Let's not forget what they just said a year ago. That was just a year ago. Okay, friends, I'm going to wind up here, because the point I wanted to make is that we have now slowly a shift in the mood. People are not interested in saying the prolongation of a colonial attitude. At least at the level of attitude, there's a shift. We know also that our concepts to handle neocolonialism today have been worn down, partly because at least a generation, if not two generations, of academics globally have been afraid to launch a full-fledged, attack, anti-colonial attack on the world system from a Marxist perspective. We just haven't seen it in the way that we needed to, for whatever reasons. And I tried to give you a few. It's not a complete sociology of knowledge, but it's at least a few indicators. And finally, these 4 points, recovering the national liberation heritage, insisting that the actual history of colonialism be on the table, trying to construct a more honest and true account of the structure of neocolonialism today. And finally, being very precise in exposing the colonial mentality that seems to saturate, television channels like BBC and so on. A colonial attitude to the world has to be exposed. We got to recover decolonization into the Marxist paradigm. Cannot allow it to slip out there and become part of this culturalist, pre-Marxist forms of thinking. We got to take that stuff back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. I don't know if you could hear the applause, but anyway, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Mary now.
Have our screen and that screen up as well. Anybody know how I do that?
Oh. Take over.
We want to find us, we're at the top, aren't we?
Yeah, and then with those 3 dots there.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I pinned. Yeah, I want to have it just like that. Super. Thanks ever so much.
Okay. Oh, I can't really see. Hello, Vijay.
Oh, sorry.
I'm Mary.
Are you sitting where you want to be?
I don't know. Am I? Is this where I should be?
Well, I'll point the camera at you.
You can do whatever you like. I'd like to see Vijay.
You look like you're ready to play the piano, Mary. La 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 la.
Okay. Vijay, that was great. Thank you so much. Just to say, but I can't because I'm just the discussant. So I'm just going to raise things that you've raised. Yeah. So it's going to be entirely unoriginal. Is that right? That's what a discussant does.
I think you should say something about what you want to say.
Okay. But so decolonization through a Marxist lens. The first big question that I want to, ask you to comment on is, have we ever really had decolonization? I'm just not sure that we have. And we talk about neocolonialism, but it still exists. Answer, I think you made the terrific points about the impact of globalization, multiculturalism, this post-Marxism, absolute nonsense, which has never really recognized, because it's anti-Marxist or even pre-Marxist, has recognized what the yeah, go on. You're waving. Do you want to say something to that?
No. I just said your audio is going in and out for me. Just repeat the immediate last thing you said after pre-Marxist.
Well, this is where Marxism is so important, as you've said, because imperialism, which is linked to racism, has never been fully grasped other than by Marxists, full stop. And that, to me, was very apparent when we talk about the battle of ideas. The fact is that we hadn't even won that battle of ideas within the labour movement. For example, in this country, Britain being the prime imperialist country that dominated, certainly after the First World War, the empire stretched massively, painted in red, and I don't need to go about the history, but the fact that is that those ideas of race and empire and the inferiority of the races that Britain conquered penetrated very deep into body politic, including into the labour movement. And in fact, it was Labour governments who and I think this is true of other countries, but I'm using Britain as an example, partly because I know most about it, and partly because it had a very developed labour movement. And so the penetration of those ideas was so deep that went itself cooperated in the neo-colonial so-called aspect when the empire was sort of going to be, it looked as though the national liberation movements were actually going to win. What did they do? The TUC then said, we need to make the world safe for British expansionism. We need to keep it safe, and we certainly need to ensure that the communism in the form of the alternative bloc of the World Federation of Trade Unions doesn't penetrate there. So let's ensure that we then have tame trade unions in those countries. They sent colonial labour advisors into all of those well, they were still colonies, to ensure that there was a little bit of social reform, a little bit of freeing up of trade unions, allowed to, they were allowed to operate. And that was the mentality. Not the most, they weren't not done. So when you talk about ideas, I absolutely the fact that our ideas have not dominated, and it's wonderful that you're quoting Krumah and Walter Rodney. I mean, the title of Walter Rodney's book was so important, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the globalisation, the stuff that you referred to before, please come back on all this. I'm doing the right thing here. I'm giving a talk. I don't mean to do that. I'm supposed to discuss with you. Well, shut me up. You shut me up as well, Vijay. Stop me whenever you want to. This post-Marxist. You mentioned saying that somehow or other that imperialism or colonization doesn't exist because now there's foreign direct investment in the global south. Well, there always was. After 1870 was capital. And where did the capital go to? It went to the empire, because the rate of return on money was absolutely phenomenal for them. The rate of return was greater where the rate of exploitation was higher, and that was in the colony. And it's still true, isn't it, Vijay? So can we really talk about, through a Marxist lens, decolonization? I put it to you, and I'll shut up.
Okay. Well,
I haven't stopped putting things to you.
That's good point one.
Okay. Sorry, the audio is really spotty. I think, I'm not sure exactly why, but I got the point. Yeah. Obviously, you're right, that, decolonization happened in phases. So it's, of course, true. Can't take it away. When India won its independence, the Communist Party of India put out a terrible slogan right then. The slogan was terrible. The slogan was, "Ye azadi jhoota hai." This independence is false. It was a terrible slogan because the general mood in 1947 was jubilation that the British have been defeated. They have left. You can't then give a slogan saying this independence is false. Of course, the slogan is correct, but it was tone deaf. Political independence is considerable. But when you have political independence, what's the next category? Liberal thought will say, well, you have political independence. But Marxism asks the next question. Are you able to establish your sovereignty? That's a key question put to us by Lenin. Lenin advances a lot of these thinkings. He gives us the key category of sovereignty. Are you able to establish your sovereignty? Not enough to have what in the African continent was known as flag independence. Not enough to have flag independence. Can you establish sovereignty? So for us, a key category is sovereignty. Why do you need sovereignty? You need sovereignty so that you can then marshal your resources in the best way possible, whether for trade or internal development, to establish the dignity of your people. These are the two key concepts, in my opinion, of a kind of Marxism of national liberation: sovereignty and dignity. And so, yes, if we look using these two concepts, we study all the countries of the world, very rarely have countries been able to establish even their sovereignty, forget dignity. Look at Cuba, for instance. The United States has been at war against Cuba since 1960. That's a 60-year war, 62-year war. We're talking about the conflict in Ukraine. What about ending the 62-year war that the United States has prosecuted against the Cuban people? That's a war. The illegal sanctions policy is a war. So you're not able to establish your sovereignty. So yes, decolonization hasn't fully occurred, but we have to also understand phases of decolonization. Certain advances take place and then there are retreats. Old Engels, when he was reviewing Marx's contribution to political economy. And by the way, Engels is a real friend because, Mary, he reviewed, I know you have reviewed my book and I highly thank you for that. But Engels reviewed contributions to political economy 8 times in 8 different journals. He really loved Marx. I mean, and in one of the reviews, he said history moves in zigs and zags. There are advances, there are retreats and so on. Right now, I would say we are in a very contradictory phase where there is a kind of new attitude being developed, kind of anti-colonial attitude, but without a real anti-colonial project. How are you going to advance out of this? And I think we don't have time to get into this, but one of the phases we are in now is a kind of demand for a sort of sovereign regionalism, increasing regional linkages to get out from under the kind of neocolonial structure, which is centered around, the banking centers of Wall Street and the city of London, perhaps Paris's Bourse and the Finanzplatz. This regional sovereignty demand is very interesting to me. And let's see where that develops. But otherwise, there's a mood against colonialism, but I don't know if there's a project actually now as there was, say, 70, 80 years ago.
So I'll ask you one more thing, and then I'm going. Well, not going, not leaving, but and that is this question of the history of colonialism to be taught in schools. Do you honestly think that is a realistic project? We don't control the ideological apparatus of the state. I wish we could. I wish we could really. And it's again with the statues and the whatever. What do you call it when you pull statue down? But anyway, not defenestration. Whatever. I mean, in a way. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. But I think it's better to put the label around the statue and say exactly who these people were and what they did. But for example, about the Amritsar massacre, we don't control the curriculum. We're talking about, we could do this in socialist society, but I don't know what your thoughts are. What might there in us trying to take hold of the ideological apparatus of the state and teach what is right before we've got socialism? I'm going to go now. Bye.
Well, look, you don't need to be a socialist to make that demand. And, every time I travel to the UK, I'm struck by the number of people that now reside in the UK whose families migrated from one colony or the other, whether it's from South Asia or from Africa or the Caribbean and so on. In fact, the actual curriculum taught to children of these former colonized zones denigrates them. You could get families, Caribbean origin families, Bangladesh origin families, and so on, to get involved in a mass campaign saying that we don't want our children to be belittled by the history being taught to them. I think that bringing the colonial history into the curriculum in this way could be much more than a campaign merely saying, let's have Jallianwala Bagh written about in the story, although that's a great place to begin. I feel like the Windrush debate that broke out in the UK recently is a great example of the lack of knowledge and understanding among the general public about British colonialism in the West Indies and what happened in that period of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the destabilization by British intelligence of Guyana, for instance, is not known by people. And I feel like there's a large enough constituency within England and Scotland and Wales that could join a mass struggle to change the way history is taught to children. And it should not just be people who have origins in these parts of the world, and others as well. I mean, I think that it's about time that trade unions are challenged again to lift up some of these banners. Transport Workers Union in London, where most of the drivers seem to have their background in one former colony or the other. It is something to ask the question is, do you want to have your children continue to feel denigrated in the curriculum that they have, where they continue to feel like the British English East India Company came to basically save them from barbarism,
Yes.
that they were barbarians before. And, along comes Robert Clive and Warren Hastings and so on, to teach them manners and to teach them how to talk proper language and not talk like barbarians and so on. This is a horrible psychological attack on young people who have different national origins and so on. So I agree that, it's not going to be an easy thing, but it seems to me like a fitting campaign for all of us to be involved in one way or the other.
Thanks very much indeed. Let's now pause and take some questions and comments from the floor and the chat.
I'm going to turn off recording.
Yes, please do. So we have the recording on. Have we got questions and comments in the chat?
Probably.
Definitely.
Oh,
8.
Hold on.
8.
Where is it? Oh, there we go.
Right. What we should also do is, before we even start taking those, there are people who are wanting to come into the